This is Rges Algebra 1, 2.4. We're talking about multiplying sign numbers. Now, multiplying sign numbers is actually much easier, quicker to get a grasp of than adding and subtracting sign numbers. Okay, very simple to do. First off, we're going to give you a definition. If you take a number, any number, and you're going to multiply it by -1, that will always equal negative x. So multiplying by -1 means you're going to have the opposite of the number. Okay. Now using that, and he goes into a lengthy explanation of why that's so on page 55, and I'll leave that for you. It's very easy to follow, but the overall rule then would be if we have a negative times a negative, it's going to equal a positive, because to multiply by a negative is the opposite. Okay, so the opposite, if I'm taking a negative but multiplying by the negative, the opposite of a negative is a positive. So a negative times a negative is a positive times a negative equals a negative. Okay, I could look at that in the inverse. If I take a negative, the opposite of the positive will be the negative. If I take negative times positive, okay, we know that multiplication is commutative, so that will also be negative. And of course, you've always been doing positive times positive since you were very young, and that is always a positive. So let's work a few examples. You're going to see how easy this is. If we say -3 times -7. This first parenthesis here is optional, okay? Because either way, it means because the 3 is hugged up next to the parenthesis before, in the way it was before. Either way, it's multiplication. Okay, so typically you'll see it this way. This is a multiplication problem. Again, the 3 is right next to the parenthesis. A negative times a negative is a positive. 3 times 7 is 21. Okay, for number 2, I guess I didn't unpause it. I've got -5 times 8. Again, for the 5's hugged up right next to the parenthesis. We know that's multiplication. A negative times a positive is a negative, and 5 times 8 is 40. Now look what happens here. I've got 3 numbers. I've got a negative times a negative. That will be positive, and then I'll have a positive times a negative, and that will be negative. Okay. Another way I could look at this is anytime you have an even number of negatives multiplied together, they will be positive, and if I have an odd number of negatives multiplied, it will be negative. So this is an odd number. The answer will be negative, and all I have to do is multiply the values together. 3 times 2 is 6. 6 times 5 is 30. So applying what I just learned, I'm going to count up the number of negatives. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 negatives being multiplied together. That's an even number of negatives. My answer will be positive. I'm just going to multiply it out. Let's say I'm going to multiply my 3 and my 2. That'd be 6 times 8 is 48. That's a 4, believe it or not. Okay, the next ones tend to be a little harder for students. Notice what this means. This means to take the -2, and multiply it out 3 times. You don't have to write this step down, provided you're very accurate on how to do it in your head. But at the beginning, feel free to. How many negatives do I have? An odd number, 3 negatives. So my answer will be negative. 2 times 2 is 4 times 2 is 8. Going to the next one. Again, I'm going to write this out. This will be -2 times -2 4 times. Because my exponent is 4, that's going to be, well, not -4, -2, 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. How many negatives do I have? 4. That's an even number. Notice if my exponent's even, right? the number of negatives will be even here. 4 times 4, that will be 16, and it will be positive because it's an even number of negative signs. Number 7 tends to be trickier for students. The question is, what are you raising to the 4th power? A -2 or a 2? Well, hopefully it's you can see that we're raising the 2 4 times because I don't have a parenthesis around the negative like I did above. Okay, so I'm only raising the 2 to the 4th power. And then I have a negative in front of it. Okay, so my answer will be negative, and 4 times 4 is 16. Please pay close attention to this versus this, because that is a frequent error among students. Okay, read over the sections that he explains carefully in class. Let's go over the oral problems together on page 58. A says, a negative times a positive, my answer will be negative, and 4 times 6 is 24. B says, a positive times a negative, my answer is negative, 3 times 8 is 24. C says, a negative times a negative, my answer is positive, 2 times 8 is 16. Could circle all these, I guess. D says, a positive times a negative, my answer is negative, and 7 times 1 is 7. E says, a negative times 0, my answer is going to be 0. Anything times 0 is 0. F says, a negative times a negative, my answer will be positive, and 8 times 7 is 56. G says, negative times a negative, my answer is positive, 1 times 9 is 9. H says, positive times negative, my answer is negative, and 4 times 8 is 32. I says, positive times positive, my answer is positive, and 6 times 7 is 42. And J says, positive times negative, my answer is negative, and 1 times 27 is 27. And now you see why I say that multiplying sign numbers is much easier than addition and subtraction. Now for K and on, all they're asking for you to do is decide if the answer is positive or negative. So K, I've got a negative times negative. I don't have to do the arithmetic. It's just going to be positive. L is a positive times a negative times a negative. That's an even number of negatives. My answer will be positive. M, I've got 3 negatives. That's an odd number of negatives. My answer will be negative. N, I've got 1 negative. My answer will be negative. O, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 negatives. That's an odd number of negatives. My answer will be negative. P, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 negatives. That's an even number, so my answer will be positive. Q, I've got a negative number in the parenthesis squared. Okay, that's going to be an even number of parentheses, so my answer will be positive. Be very careful with these next ones. Make sure you understand them. I've got an odd number of negatives. Okay, I've got a negative number cubed, so an odd number of negatives will be negative. S, I've got a negative number to the 19th power. That's an odd number of negatives, so it'll be negative. T, I've got a negative number to the 100th power. That's an even number of negatives. It will be positive. U, I've got negative 44 to the 6. So this will be positive, but this makes it negative. So this will be a negative number. And V, I've got the same kind of idea. I've got the negative in front of a number raised to a power. So this will be positive, that's to the 10th power, but this makes it negative. This one will also be negative, V. Okay? Evaluating the last ones, I have -1 to the 70th power. That's an even number, so it's going to be +1. X, I've got a -1 to a 53rd power. That's an odd number, so my answer will be -1. Y, I've got -1 to the 28th power. This is 1, but this makes it negative. So my answer is -1. Make sure you're following through that idea. That's very critical. And then 0, I think that says 35. It might say 55, but let's say it says 35. That's 0 times 0, 35 times 0 times anything is 0.